Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gillian, Director and Chief Psychologist here at PCL. We are a firm of business psychologists specialising in assessment, and particularly in personality assessment and its application to leadership development, team development, and high-stakes selection. We also are UK distributors of the globally renowned Hogan personality assessments.
And I'm Sophie, one of the Senior Consultant Psychologists here at PCL, and we'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, where myself and Gillian will be exploring how psychometric testing can be applied within a private equity context, and specifically how these tools and assessments can help individuals, whether that's an investor or a portfolio leader, to make more informed decisions when it comes to their talent, their leadership potential, and team dynamics as well. So we're going to discuss some of the most effective ways that psychometric insights can support value creation. And we hope you'll come away with a really clear understanding of how to use data-driven assessments to strengthen people and performance across the deal lifecycle. So to get us started, Gillian, recently there's been a really kind of focus on, using psychometrics within this private equity context. Seems to have become a real talking point, and I'm keen to hear from you first why you think this is.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, it does seem there's been quite a shift in understanding, or indeed recognising even, that talent management, particularly in relation to leaders, is critical to the three main stages of a portco. That would be due diligence, value creation, and exit strategy too. Assessing leaders at the due diligence stage, for example, could be hugely beneficial, as a lot of portco CEOs actually tend to be replaced during the investment cycle. So assessing up front, making sure you've got the right leader in place from the beginning, and then whether ultimately that's continuing to work with the existing one or replacing them, as well as using assessments at that stage to identify future talent, potential future talent, can obviously save quite a lot of time and money later on down the line, and equip the investors with valuable information too. But I think that also the focus on people or talent in general as critical to value creation in particular has received a lot of attention of late. Probably because of a few factors. Firstly, the trend towards longer holds means that investing in talent and strong leadership just simply makes more sense. Investing in your people, they're going to be, hopefully, some of them are going to be around for longer. Median hold times are now at a record high of 7 years. So the people management strategy, the talent management strategy, is part of something that will feed into achieving sustainable long-term growth. Secondly, the aging population simply means more retirements, more key people at that key stage in their careers, which in turn means a need for strong succession planning and early leadership development to get people ready in the pipeline. So those factors come together, which mean that there's just more focus on human capital as a value driver now more than ever. In the past, the overwhelming majority of value creation came from financial engineering, whereas now today this is much, much smaller, with the rest coming from operational improvements and talent management. And in fact, to take this a step further, it seems that many PE-backed firms are now citing talent above operational efficiency in terms of creating value. And a recent report by Egon Zehnder put it rather nicely. I thought they described it as this area being seen as the last frontier of value creation. So that's the whole people side of things, talent management side of things. They talk about it as being an area where untapped potential can be unlocked through strategic leadership, talent orchestration, and cultural transformation.
Amazing. Yeah, last frontier sounds quite important, doesn't it, when you put it that way? I think obviously there's also some points around the fact that now more than ever there's this focus on reducing subjectivity, isn't there, and trying to bring as much data as possible into a hiring process or whatever the need might be. So those things might be playing their part as well. And with that in mind, how would you say the kind of context or the priorities differ in a portfolio company compared to others?
I think there's just simply more pressure, isn't there? Even though today we just said there are longer hold times, there's just is more pressure. It's kind of more tangible outcomes that you're looking for. So more pressure, both time-wise and growth-wise. That focus on immediate and or strong results to be ready for sale. The quote, I've got a quote here, PE prides itself on moving fast, getting results faster. So all of that plays its part, and it means that everybody within that kind of company is just much more obviously accountable for both their own and the company's success. So that is kind of ever present, which it isn't necessarily in other organizations. Obviously, other organizations need to be profitable, but they don't have those kind of deadlines and those very obvious goals that they're aiming for. And a lot, of course, depends on getting it right. There, a survey by Bain and Company in conjunction with Hunt Scanlon Media found that the caliber of a portfolio company's leadership team is considered the top reason for deal success and the second most common reason for deal failure. So it comes into play a lot. But of course, this creates a problem because a lot of people would see actually replacing the CEO as something quite risky, really highly risky, particularly at the time of investment. But at the same time, there's a general awareness that delaying leadership changes could cause underperformance. And as mentioned before, there's a high rate of portco C-suite turnover, particularly among CEOs and CFOs. It seems from a recent HBR article, they suggested that about 75% leave within 1 to 2 years of the acquisition. So it's trying to kind of square that circle of, but it's risky to replace the CEO, but they might move on anyway, or if we don't, it could relate to underperformance. So getting some objective assessment in there to help you make those decisions at that pre-investment stage obviously could be hugely helpful.
Yeah, and such costly decisions as well, getting it wrong or investing and getting it right as well. And I know we were both reading that Egon Zehnder report you mentioned before as well. Actually, there was another quote in there around in PE-backed companies, there is no runway for consensus building or incremental change. The expectation is immediate impact. And that really stuck with me in terms of what the key priorities are. We'll pop the reference for that for those of you that are watching in the comments when we post this up on our YouTube. I think if we think about then the kind of different PE contexts that may require or kind of benefit from using psychometrics, clearly we've got kind of the pre-deal situation, we've got due diligence, we've got possibly kind of strategic hiring later down the line. What differences might you see or have you seen in your experience from the approach that you might take with using psychometrics in those different scenarios?
Yeah, I think so during due diligence, the focus is probably mainly going to be on assessing the quality of the existing leadership team and trying to predict how the portco might perform under the direction of the existing leadership team. Do the people that are in place right now have what it takes to succeed into the next phase? And you can use personality assessment here to provide good, clear, objective insights into the existing talent of that leadership team and help inform investors and help them with their decision making. Because you can use that assessment to find out how the leadership team is likely to perform on a daily basis. Also, you can look at what their values and motives are, and of course, how they might function or indeed derail when they are in more difficult times or when working under serious pressure. But also, it can be really useful to get this assessment information if a portco is moving into an unfamiliar industry or unfamiliar to the existing leadership team, or an area where they're still kind of getting up to speed, still gaining expertise. We work with Hogan Assessments, and they have a number of industry benchmarks looking at profiles of leaders in lots of different industries. So, for example, if a portco is going to be moving more into the tech area, into IT, Then there's an IT benchmark that you could assess the current leadership team against, see how they match up to others in that industry, which then obviously in turn can help with the decision making. You can see, are there big gaps? Or is there reasonable alignment? Does it look like, they would be able to perform in this kind of sector? So yeah, if there are changes needed, this process can help to pinpoint the personality characteristics that are most likely to lead to success. And this can help focus the executive search if indeed one is necessary. So those are things that can happen before investment. But after investment, I think the focus is going to be more on creating value through the people that you have. So here you'd be using assessment to inform things like leader onboarding, but also individual and/or team development. And indeed, this isn't assessment necessarily, but sometimes it then moves on to executive coaching so that you can use the assessments to tee it up, but the executive coaching might then be an add-on, depending on what the individual leader felt they needed from that process. So I think those kinds of steps are more important or appropriate after the investment stage. Also at that point, say if you've got new people joining the existing structure, then having their assessment information, see how they match up with others, can be useful. Also, if you could persuade them, or if through a team development session, you do something where people open up and they share their profiles with each other and the existing team, then that can be a great way to get people really quickly up to speed with key people they're going to be working with in terms of understanding and appreciating each other, where they're the same, where they're different, and leveraging both points of similarity and difference to best effect. So that can be a really useful way of using assessments. And I think the focus on leaders at this stage is going to be more about their ability to lead and motivate the team, to create a high-performing team, create a strong culture for the organisation that others can align with and sign up to. So individual development or coaching, again, can help with that.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think what you've demonstrated there is how the assessments can really be layered and kind of built upon once you've started using them somewhere, to then kind of take it one step further and keep revisiting the data. And maybe from your experience, could you share an example of a time where you've really seen the insight from a psychometric assessment have a real impact, whether that was positive or negative?
Yeah, I worked a couple of years ago with a startup fintech company that was being funded through venture capital from an investment bank. And my job was to assess all of the C-suite, some of whom were kind of newer to the organisation. And so sometimes I was assessing them for selection, but for everybody, I was assessing them kind of for their onboarding and their individual development and their team development as well. So I worked with them as a team, and I worked with them to create individual development plans. But the CFO was perhaps not, wasn't the best fit for him. Although various development strategies were used, it was clear from the assessments that the gap was going to be too large. He lacked the confidence really to stand out, to really be a strong leader for his team, and he was aware of this, and to demonstrate the passion that was needed in that kind of environment. He was perhaps almost too collaborative rather than a strong leader. So ultimately he had to be replaced to give the business what it needed, because it needed someone who could cope better with the fast-paced, results-driven environment.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good example of, I guess, the shift in expectations, and maybe it worked originally, but perhaps wasn't suited for that next iteration. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, he could be a really brilliant CFO in a different kind of context. It was the context that wasn't right for him. It wasn't the right fit. Yeah,
exactly. And I've actually worked on a similar project as well. It was a CEO search for a PE-backed pet food business, and we ended up doing psychometrics with the final 3 candidates in that process, interviewing them and using the data to guide those final rounds of interview. And I think the insights that came through to help that decision-making piece was really fascinating, really helpful for the board and the investors to know kind of what the risks were, but also what strengths they were going to be getting with each of the candidates that were available, and specifically suitable for that next phase, you know, who was going to bring the right skill set as and when required. Fab, thank you very much. I guess what we'll do now is zoom out slightly, and I'd like you to perhaps just have a think about other advantages for using psychometrics. So we've talked initially about that kind of data piece and what can come with using them, but what else have you seen in terms of the benefits that can come from using psychometrics in these sorts of contexts?
I think that using objective assessments like this can really help actually to introduce more diversity in your employees, rather than recruiting people, say, in your own mold, people who have something in common with you, have qualities that you feel you understand because there's something, you know, that you've done that's similar from your background or your education or your experience. All of those things can really impact, you know, assessors' judgments, particularly at interview. But bringing in objective assessment can really help to kind of dull that noise a bit, try to remove some of that noise that will inevitably be there. You can't get rid of it altogether. But the thing with assessment is what you want to do is it's not just about the quality of the assessment. You want to start off by thinking, what is it I want to measure? What do I need to measure? What do I need from this particular appointment? So the starting point is to think about, well, what are the competencies? What are the skills that we need to assess for? And then, you know, we work with organisations where we map our assessments to the critical competencies or key skills that are needed. So these are the things that become key rather than who you know or where you went to school or you know, do you support the same football team, or all those kinds of things that can, you know, inevitably creep in to decisions that we make. So if that kind of process, defining what it is you want to measure and then measuring it objectively through assessment, can be part of your selection process, you're going to really increase the odds of just bringing in people that you wouldn't otherwise, so increasing the diversity of your employees, which can only be positive, really. I think, you know, when we are interviewing, we all have unconscious biases, and they do creep in, and we make assumptions about people based on things that we do or don't have in common. And so the psychometrics introduce the objectivity and a much fairer point of comparison, because you're measuring those qualities in a standardized way. You're not asking people different questions each time you interview. They're being asked the same questions. They're being measured against a standardized metric, and the results, hopefully, are being aligned with the competencies and the skills that you're looking for. So you're actually assessing and selecting on the skills and characteristics that are required to do the job. So that's kind of number one. And the second area where I think assessments can really add a value is around talent analytics, because they do provide lots of data points when you've done assessments. So you will then have useful data points on your people who you have chosen to work with you, and you can track performance. You can link successful performance then to certain aspects from their personality profile or their values profile. And of course, that can help with benchmarking, with talent management, and with succession planning.
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting that data in early days, isn't it? So you can then roll it out and keep looking back at it. Yeah, fantastic. And I guess just to challenge you on that, I guess striking a balance between intuition versus the data, what advice would you give someone that is perhaps struggling to weigh up the two, or trying to go with their gut, or seeing a conflict maybe with the psychometrics?
So yeah, of course, when you're interviewing and using assessment, it might be that sometimes the information and the judgment from the interview aligns with the profile and the information from the assessment. And there might be sometimes when it doesn't. And so you've got to think about, well, so which source of information is kind of king here, is the one that I'm going to look to. And it isn't necessarily a case of one versus the other, though. So if, for instance, you had a profile that was less positive than the judgment from the interview, what you'd want to be looking at is, okay, so where is the misalignment? Is it, for instance, on interpersonal skills? Is the judgment that from the interview, this person's interpersonal skills are much better than their profile would suggest that they are? Well, okay, so have a think about, well, where's the evidence? What's the evidence that I'm using to make that judgment about their interpersonal skills? And would I like to seek out some more evidence? Because psychometrics aren't 100% perfect. I mean, they are pretty good, particularly if you use something like the Hogan assessments, and they are consistent and they have been validated. But, we are all individuals and we all have our own sort of nuances, and we all have aspects of our behavior that we sometimes can compromise on, or sometimes we can actually work around, especially as we mature and get more life and work experience under our belt. So an interview, this person might have impressed and looked really interpersonally skilled, but in actual fact on their profile it might look like they're really introverted and reserved and don't talk very much. So then you've got to think, okay, so how important is that for the job? Is it an important skill characteristic that's needed for the job? And if it is, okay, what else could I do then, maybe to get some more evidence of this? Or what further questioning could I ask the individual about? And it may be that what comes out of that is something, this is something that the person's aware of and they've been able to work around it. They've made a concerted effort to improve, but it still doesn't come naturally to them. And then you've got to think, well, how important is that? Do I need somebody who is always going to be listening to people, that's sort of at the forefront, that's their number one priority, and all that kind of thing? And if it isn't, then maybe what you do need is somebody who's more in the middle, but actually has strategies in place to work around it. So I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded way of answering your question, which is, it is a balancing act, and you will sometimes have a difference of opinion between the assessment and the interview judgment. And where that happens, I would advise, number one, is it a key competency or skill that's required? And if it is, try to seek out some more evidence.
Yeah, I think it's really highlighted, I guess, the importance of having maybe other people's opinions to bounce off as well when you're in those interview panels. And also having a key list of your priorities, like you say, so what is essential and maybe what can be kind of bottom of that list.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gillian. So if we shift now, I guess, from the why and focus on the what, I'd be really keen to hear from your perspective what you think PE firms are looking for trait-wise. So what does success look like in these roles from a personality perspective?
Well, actually, I did tune in recently to a webinar on this very topic hosted by Hogan Assessment Systems. And they made the point that qualities such as having a growth mindset, being agile, being flexible, adaptable, all of those things are now seen as more important than classic leadership, the notion of a sort of charismatic strategic leader, because they're having to deal with so many disruptions. They no longer are working in a stable economic pattern, hence this demand for more sort of flexible, agile leaders becomes more critical. They also mentioned, I thought quite an interesting point though, that investors might see this differently to the people actually working in the business. So that's kind of a topic to be raised probably if you were working with investors and doing assessments pre-deal. So a lot of PE investment people tend to have a finance background, and maybe their perfect, or their notion of a perfect CEO is somebody who's like that savior person. But rarely, in fact, those who are actually in the company, running the company, necessarily agree with that. It's morphed and evolved now into more of a team sport. Yes, they need to inspire, but they need to motivate, they need to bring the team with them. And I guess, you layer those qualities on top then of the flexible, agile characteristics that are needed in the dynamic marketplace. And those are kind of all of the things that you're looking for.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think if I just echo a few bits that came through from the research that we were doing as well, that Egon Zehnder report that we referenced earlier, they talked about the classic things in terms of financial acumen, being data-driven, being highly adaptive, but also, as to your point, being able to pivot really quickly in response to changing circumstances and being resilient in the face of ambiguity. And then there was also a really interesting report, a PwC Global CEO Survey from 2024, and they consistently found that the most successful execs are those who can embrace uncertainty rather than try to eliminate risk. And I thought that really illustrated that point quite nicely as well. Anything else that you've seen or kind of across sectors, any differences you've witnessed?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's always good to remember that different characteristics are needed in lots of different sectors, not just PE, not just the PE sector. For example, we recently did some research with a client looking at profiles of public sector CEOs and comparing them to private sector CEOs and the workforce in general. And one standout characteristic for public sector CEOs was their relative sort of emotional stability. And their steadiness. They tend, on average, to sort of keep things under control, keep things on an even keel, don't tend to vent emotionally or perhaps show their moods quite so much. And this is in contrast to the private sector, where there's a degree more emotionality to be found. And perhaps one could hypothesize, that's because we need people in that sector with a bit more fire in more dynamic settings. Maybe sometimes, a sprinkling of emotionality gives you that passion, gives you that sort of extra edge. And also maybe even in private sector or particular parts of the private sector, these more sort of changeable personalities are perhaps more tolerated as well. There is that. You might hypothesize that kind of these more extremes, these more changeable personalities are likely to be more tolerated in, say, more enterprising or more creative environments. So there are always, slight differences to be found in different environments, different contexts. But going back to the PE sector, I guess, the time pressure to perform, to produce results is so key. So while I think there would be some qualities of leaders that could be universal, things like having a vision and communicating that vision, bringing people with you, I think for the PE-backed businesses, this agility, the flexibility, the resilience piece, the growth mindset piece is just very acute and particularly needed, perhaps more so than in other sectors, because that need for fast action is so critical.
Yeah, understood. And if you were kind of one of the key decision makers in a process using psychometrics, how would you balance the kind of short-term needs compared to the long-term needs or aspirations from a leader that you might be assessing?
Well, I think there's some similar points here, perhaps, to where the things that we've touched on and the themes around pre-deal versus strategic hiring. And yes, I guess the short term is all about that resilience, adaptability, agility piece. So you want to select leaders who have those characteristics. But longer term, the things that are going to carry that leader through, keep them being successful, keep the organization being successful, is much more around the leading the team, creating that positive, strong culture and motivating others. And these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. It's just that it could be about the same leader drawing on different aspects of their personality or their values at different stages, or indeed in different processes and different aspects of the work.
Yeah, understood. So pulling on different strengths that they might have at different times. Yeah. And actually on that point, how can psychometrics, from your experience, uncover those hidden strengths, or I guess also hidden risks that an individual or a leadership team even might have?
Well, I think as individuals, a lot of us, we tend to downplay our strengths, so we really sort of take them for granted. We don't necessarily see them as being special. And conversely, we might also sort of ignore our development areas, or we might be a bit aware of them, but we're not really aware of the impact they're having on other people. And do we really need to do something about it? So assessments can really help in both of these areas. So they can highlight individual strengths, because when we assess individuals, we profile them, and we profile them against other populations. So you see to what, you might think, for instance, that you might describe yourself as averagely ambitious, for instance. But when you're actually profiled, you might discover that in actual fact, you are more ambitious than 90% of the general population. So then knowing where you stand relative to others on certain characteristics really clearly starts to show you where your strengths lie, especially if you have somebody interpreting that profile for you who can say, well, what does that mean in practice? What does it mean in terms of your actual workplace behavior? What is it that you are going to do? So that's where these assessments can really help in identifying your strengths and understanding where you are kind of exceptional compared to others. But they can also focus on things that we maybe do that are overplayed strengths, and that when we sort of stretch them too far and do too much of them and don't think about how we're coming across to other people, tip over into a more counterproductive style of behavior. Now, the thing is that these will be quite distinct defining characteristics of us, and we might be quite fond of them even, and really just we might sort of think, yeah, I really shouldn't do that quite that much, but we haven't yet quite got to the stage that of understanding. But if you consistently do that, then you are going to irritate people, confuse people, and so on. So an example of that might be somebody who is generally perceives themselves as being quite positive and optimistic and self-confident in their ability to get stuff done. But when they overplay that, when they are not thinking about how they're coming across to other people, then it can tip over into seeming very arrogant or entitled, or their view is the only right one. They're not really listening to other people, or if they're getting negative feedback, they're sort of putting that to one side and not really considering it as important. And so it's not until we get the feedback on that we begin to understand, okay, so that is something that I am different to most people on, and that yes, when I'm in the strength zone on it, it has been probably the reason for part of my success so far. But when I do too much of it, then people are going to leave me. They're not going to want to work with me. They will be put off from working with me because I am being so entitled and so arrogant. And again, I mean, that's just one form. There's lots of ways in which we can derail, depending on our particular profile. But that's a particular assessment that comes from the Hogan Development Survey. So that's an area that we can help people with. And you can see how that really feeds in, obviously, to leadership development, individual development, and can form the basis of coaching as well, in fact.
Yeah, and it ties in really nicely to a question that one of our clients raised, actually, which was around how important it is to understand the profiles of the individuals surrounding the main person that you're wanting to assess. So all well and good, maybe assessing the new CEO or looking for a new CEO, but what about the rest of the C-suite? What about the rest of the board? Keen to hear your perspective on that, whether that's something you'd recommend, and if so, kind of anything you'd add.
Yeah, so obviously we don't operate in a vacuum, do we? And so every aspect of our personality has an impact on others and vice versa. So it's not that there's a perfect solution. It's not like you need your whole C-suite to look exactly like this. But there might be certain things, certain characteristics you say, we need them to be this and that and the other, A, B, C. But then after that, there can be lots of differences, and that can be across personality and it can be across values as well. And it's not to say that, as I said, there is no one perfect solution, and it's not to say that differences aren't a good thing. We've talked before about the diversity paradox. You do want some diversity. But what's key to this is if people will share that information and be open about it, or find a forum to do that, or have a team development session where you can share that to start to unlock what might be some blocked relationships, where people, if we don't understand each other, we can get caught in a cycle where things just aren't working very well, and we're not able to be effective from either side. So if we can have that information and start to understand each other and how we're different and why we might have different approaches to decision making, for instance, why we have different priorities, all that kind of stuff really, really helps in terms of being more tolerant of each other, understanding that we might have different priorities to each other. And so there's that side to it. There's also, of course, looking at, assessing the people around a leader. There's also the, what does good look like, and benchmarking the existing team against that, comparing and contrasting, say, a new leader who's coming into the team with what you've already got, seeing if there are matches, seeing if there are gaps, seeing where there might be potential issues, and ideally, feeding it into some kind of introductory session where these themes can be spoken about candidly and sort of unreservedly and shared. I think understanding other people's priorities and how they're different to yours can be it's such a useful thing to know, and begin and really helps you to understand why you might always be at loggerheads with somebody, because you're always coming at it from a different perspective. So understanding and appreciating those other perspectives is another area where assessment can really feed into and inform.
Yeah, and especially kind of pertinent in this situation in PE where the pressure is there, the time is another factor as well. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of kind of comparing and contrasting candidates, any advice that you could share on when to kind of rule in versus rule out candidates, or how you might use the assessment data to certain extents?
I think a lot of the time, and this might sound like the typical psychologist sitting on the fence, I do realise that, but I think a lot of the time the assessment piece will just be one part of the process, and it will be supporting other information, whether it's from references or whether it's from interviews or whether it's from experience and so on. And a lot of the time it will be about just trying to find the best imperfect fit, but the closest to the perfect that you're looking for. And then thinking about ways to manage or support that person in areas where they might need it. So mostly it will be in support of other information, I think, rather than a rule in, rule out.
Okay.
But I think there might be a couple of situations where you might use it to rule out. And so one would be, say, if you're down to 2 candidates and you have done your competency mapping, your alignment with the assessments, and one of them clearly has a better fit from their profile, then maybe that would be one scenario where you would rule one candidate in and one out. Or maybe, yes, again, when you're down to the very short list, if one of your candidates who looks good at everything except that they've actually got quite a few derailers. Because the more derailers, so would be high scores on the Hogan Development Survey. It's just the more you have of those. Most of us have got 2 or 3, but if you have a lot, then you just are going to be a more difficult person to be around and to work with, and particularly in a team setting.
Yeah, and a high-pressured team.
Yes.
For our previous points. Yeah, okay, fantastic, thank you. And like you said, we have been talking a bit about diversity at various points in this conversation, but curious to hear from your perspective how you can prioritise this kind of diversity of thought, but at the same time get alignment or cohesion, in particular when it comes to values, because I know we've spoken about the fact that alignment there is probably going to be particularly important.
I think this is another balancing act. So it's really important for a successful organisation to have that overarching sense of purpose and overarching shared mission. If you think of Apple, for instance, that obviously one of their key drivers is around designing beautiful, innovative products. So probably most people in Apple share that aspiration and share that value. But then after that, there might be differences. There might be points of difference. And in actual fact, it can be a good thing to have some diversity so that people aren't just doing the same old thing or always agreeing with each other or prioritizing the same things. It can lead to bad decisions. There was some recent research by a business school that had a few different groups and they were defined differently in terms of their level of cohesion as a team. And they were set a murder mystery problem to solve. And they found that the ones who were the most had the highest degrees of cohesion kind of came to their answer the fastest and were the most confident in it, but were more often wrong. And the ones who were right were those who were less cohesive. They made a better judgment. They solved the problem correctly more often. So that diversity of thought obviously was key to actually solving the problem correctly. So you can see immediately how that might play out in the workplace as well. So you've got these two elements. You want some degree of diversity of thought, but you also want something that combines people, something that they share. So in a way, it's about squaring the circle, and the leader's role here is really important in both creating that overarching mission that people sign up to and enjoy and like and feel positive about, whilst also at the same time encouraging the diversity of view and of thought and of perspective.
Yeah, and I guess that links as well to psychological safety, doesn't it, in terms of welcoming those opinions and making sure that people share their views.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Another question we had from one of our clients actually was just around how important the context is, or the broader context. So it's all well and good maybe assessing one leader or doing one selection process, but what role does the context play on how you might use those results or how you might interpret the profiles? Any thoughts there?
I think this does touch on some themes we've mentioned, but just to expand on that a bit, a couple of years ago, we did some research on our archival Hogan personality database, and we compared people working in various sectors across the three instruments, across the bright side personality instrument and the dark side personality instrument and the values instrument. And we did find some small differences between Hogan profiles across various industry sectors, although probably the most consistent ones for personality perspectives were perhaps between just public and private sector, where we got consistent differences, particularly on the derailers profile, where those in the private sector were higher on what are called the moving against scales, so scales associated with more influence. So it feeds into those stereotypes of those in the private sector being perhaps more persuasive, influential, commanding, etc. So there was a fairly consistent difference between public and private, but then looking at the industry sectors in more detail, not a lot of differences across personality, except for when we came to comparing values. And that's where we found our biggest differences across different industry sectors. So, for example, the healthcare sample were high on science value. Those in food and beverage were high on hedonism. So some wonderful stereotyping going on there as well. But, that makes sense, obviously, that people would choose to work in kinds of environments and cultures that reflect their values. These values, they impact the culture that a leader creates and the people around them as well. So if people also are contributors to that culture. So if you were to drill down then into other kinds of sectors, you might, for instance, hypothesize, for engineering, for instance, a focus on good, effective, innovative working product is key. While, say, in media, to contrast, the focus is going to be on creating entertainment and maximizing audience enjoyment. Very, very different goals in life there. And an example of these two worlds colliding is the merger that took place a while back between AT&T and Time Warner. So AT&T is an engineering firm, Time Warner is an entertainment company. So engineers, you might say, value process and control, artists value freedom and exploration. These values just completely clash and are incompatible. And in fact, the business as a merger failed. So Time Warner's creative culture was destroyed in months, and the deal failed, and AT&T sold Time Warner. So you can't kind of underestimate the difference in particular industry sectors will attract certain kinds of people who hold certain kinds of values, and some will fit and some won't.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us on to maybe what to do or how to manage clashes in values between the founder and the PE firm or potential investors. Have you ever seen that go wrong, that go right? What's coming to mind on that front?
Well, I think obviously you can only kind of sort of take a snapshot of what is happening at that particular time. Things might evolve over the deal, but if you are beginning the deal and your assumption is that the founder will remain or that significant people around the founder will remain, then those founders' values are key and really need to be respected. But if at some point changes need to be made, then you can't just come in broad brush and expect people to just change the way that they think and the way that they prioritize and what's important to them. It has to be made. Those changes need to be made slowly. There needs to be consultation. There needs to be clear explanations to people as to why those changes are needing to be made. Because if that sort of core set of values just gets brushed aside, the whole mission becomes different. It's not what other people signed up for. It isn't the place that they thought they were working for anymore. And you won't take people with you. People will leave if those values are just ignored. So again, it's a balancing act. It's thinking, well, what is it you need to retain in order for this future success? I absolutely understand that changes might need to be made, but it needs to be a gradual, incremental process, and perhaps some of those initial values still need to remain.
Yeah, and it highlights, doesn't it, that actually if you are hiring a key position like a CEO, you need someone who can also do that as a skill. So respect the existing values and find a way of kind of moving them in the right direction as well without isolating people. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I guess final piece here, just curious about any advice you might have for firms or individuals who are maybe starting out on their psychometric journey. Maybe they haven't used an assessment before, maybe they don't know what to expect. Any words of wisdom you could share for those sorts of individuals at this point?
Well, I think step number one is to try to make sure that you find some expert consultants in assessment. Obviously, I'm biased, I would say psychologists, but it doesn't have to be, actually. We train people in psychometrics, and there are some people out there who are very good at this stuff, and they might have more of an L&D background or whatever. But just make sure you find people who really are experts in assessment, and maybe ask for examples of their work. Ask them to explain themselves. Is there anything they say that you don't understand, then ask them to explain it again, because in our world we should be able to do that for you. We do need to be able to translate what we're saying, what our ideas are, what the information we get into something that's useful and meaningful for you. Check out what types of assessment are available, what do you think is going to be best for you, and obviously that will align with what it is you're wanting to measure. Are you wanting to measure personality? Do you think you might want to also measure cognitive ability? Might you want to do something that's a bit more scenario based, so you get a kind of predictor of how they're likely to perform at work with a particular piece of work? So that's something that can be created for you. Bespoke assessments, situational judgment tests, and so on can be created. Maybe if you can ask them to try out an initial assessment, or at least they could give you an example of something they've done before, where they actually show you an outcome from the assessment. Don't be afraid to ask for the process to be tailored or altered for you, so that it really matches what you need. It's got to be something that completely works for you. And make sure, this is really important, make sure that it's aligned to something that matters. That, what is it that you want to assess and why? Be really, really clear about that. And you might work with the consultant to define that as well. But that is step number one, actually, in a way, is what is it I want to measure? Yeah, and just going back, but make sure you get information out of this that's useful to you and that you can understand. If there's any gobbledygook coming out of it, you need to question that. You need to push back on that. And this is partly down to the skill of the consultant in making sure that they assess what's important and that they can explain it to you in a really clear, comprehensible fashion. And also, perhaps you might need to be patient. Be prepared to assess perhaps plenty of candidates who aren't going to fit. I came across this quote about PE. It says, private equity is not for everyone. It is a high pressure, high stakes environment that demands speed, precision, and resilience. For leaders who are more accustomed to long planning cycles, consensus driven decision making, or incremental change, the transition can be jarring. So just remember, there'll be plenty of people out there who making that change isn't going to be right for them. They're not going to be the right fit. But there will, of course, be others who are completely up for it.
Yeah, much better to know before you've made them a job offer or appointed them into a key position, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that's been really insightful. Thank you so much, Gillian, for sharing your perspective on everything. As we've mentioned, we will make sure that all those reports and any pieces of research that we've referenced will go into the comments so that you can all follow up on those at home. But all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you all.